Mount Willow, a small town in New Hampshire, was a quiet place with distinct changing seasons. Eleanor's Sweets, located on Main Street, was the most renowned upscale confectionery shop in town. The owner, Eleanor Morgan, was absorbed in putting the finishing touches on macarons as the afternoon sunlight streamed into her shop. "Perfect," Eleanor murmured to herself as she arranged the pastel-colored, lavender-scented macarons in the glass display case. This shop was her pride and joy, and also her emotional support, especially during these past 3 years. The bell on the door rang, and Eleanor looked up. Her husband Dean walked in confidently. His thick brown hair was beginning to show flecks of gray, but his blue-gray eyes were still filled with kindness. He looked almost the same as when they had met in college. "How's your day?" Dean asked, approaching Eleanor and kissing her cheek. As the owner of an architectural firm, he always made it a point to stop by his wife's shop on his way home from work. "The usual. Maria left early today." "It's her son's birthday," Eleanor smiled softly. "I'm thinking of making lasagna tonight." The couple sat at a table in the back of the shop and talked about the events of the day. The conversation flowed naturally, but occasionally, there were unavoidable moments of silence. During these times, their eyes would drift toward the photograph displayed on the counter. It showed a smiling little girl with large brown eyes and black hair, with features resembling her father but with her mother's innocent smile. Sophie Morgan. Their daughter who had lost her life at just 5 years old, 3 summers ago. The memory of that night was still etched in Eleanor's mind. After dinner, they had put Sophie to bed and were watching television downstairs when they were awakened by the smell of smoke. Flames were rising from the second floor and quickly spreading throughout the house. They desperately tried to reach Sophie's room, but the stairs were already engulfed in flames. When firefighters arrived and dragged Eleanor and Dean out of the building, they were still screaming, "Our daughter! Our daughter is still inside." But the flames were too intense, and rescue was impossible. The next morning, the small body found in the ashes was barely recognizable. DNA tests confirmed it was indeed their daughter Sophie. The cause of the fire was determined to be an electrical system malfunction, but Eleanor continued to blame herself. If only she had noticed sooner, if only she had made it to her daughter's room more quickly. After the tragedy, their marriage was in crisis. Eleanor in particular fell into a deep depression and stayed at a friend's apartment for several months. And the attitude of Dean's parents, Miriam and George, only made matters worse. "If you had been more careful, this wouldn't have happened," Miriam said to Eleanor one day. It wasn't a direct accusation, but there was clearly blame behind her words. Dean's parents were always strict people who demanded a perfect family, and they had high expectations for their son's wife as well. Sophie's death was, in their eyes, proof of Eleanor's failure. The relationship between Dean and Eleanor was at its coldest 6 months after the fire, when Dean's sister Cassandra suddenly cut off contact and moved to the countryside. Unmarried and with a history of mental health issues, Cassandra had mourned her niece's death particularly deeply. She had adored Sophie, so her death was probably an unbearable grief for her. But time gradually brought healing. Eleanor reopened her confectionery shop, and Dean continued to support her. They moved to a new house and tried to reclaim their normal lives bit by bit. Though the wounds remained unhealed, the couple was trying to find a way to move forward together. Sophie's photograph was displayed both on the shop counter and in their living room, and her presence continued to accompany them in their daily lives. Grief came in waves, but somehow they managed to get through it. "How about watching a movie tonight for the first time in a while?" Dean suggested. "That new romantic comedy is getting good reviews." Eleanor nodded slightly. "That sounds nice." As they left the shop, Eleanor, as always, glanced at her daughter's photograph. "Good night, Sophie," she whispered in her heart. "Mommy and Daddy love you." The door closed, and Eleanor and Dean headed home. They were still on the road to recovery, but at least now they were together. On an October evening as autumn was setting in, Eleanor was wiping down the display case, preparing to close the shop. Outside the window, the street trees were beginning to turn red and yellow, and passers-by were gradually starting to wear light coats. As she was polishing the glass, something moved at the edge of her vision. A small girl had stopped outside the shop and was peering into the display window. She appeared to be about 7 or 8 years old, wearing dirty clothes, with messy black hair. When Eleanor made eye contact, the girl drew back in surprise. In that moment, Eleanor felt her chest tighten. The girl's face looked familiar. From somewhere. Before she could think, the girl hurriedly ran away. Eleanor tried to call out, but no voice came. She stared out the window, watching the girl's figure disappear around the corner of the street. What was that about? After locking up the shop, Eleanor headed home. Her mind was filled with thoughts of the girl she had just seen. She sensed something odd but couldn't put her finger on what it was. "I'm home," she called out upon arriving at the house. "Welcome back." "I'm cooking today," Dean's voice replied from the kitchen. Eleanor smiled when she saw Dean cooking with an apron on. He had been trying to improve his cooking skills lately. This, too, was part of their new normal. "That's perfect." "I was feeling tired," Eleanor said, sitting down on the living room sofa. When dinner was ready, they sat at the dining table. The lasagna Dean had made wasn't as bad as it looked. The vegetables were a bit hard, but it was warm and delicious. "Yes, you've definitely improved," Eleanor praised him honestly. "I've been watching cooking videos on YouTube," Dean replied, looking a bit embarrassed. "But it's still nowhere near as good as your lasagna." During dinner, Dean raised his wine glass and said with a slightly tense expression, "Hey, Elle. There's something I've been thinking about." Eleanor noticed her husband's serious expression and put down her fork. "What is it?" Dean took a deep breath and continued. "What do you think about considering a child again?" At those words, Eleanor froze. A child. That had been a topic they had avoided. "You want another one?" Her voice was small. "We're not forgetting Sophie," Dean quickly said. He took his wife's hand. "But it's been 3 years now. We're still young. I think it might be time to expand our family again." Eleanor tried to speak, but no words came out. Complicated emotions swirled inside her. Guilt, fear, and a small hope. "You don't need to answer right now," Dean said gently. "I just want you to think about it." Eleanor nodded slightly. "I'll think about it." After dinner, they were watching television in the living room. In Eleanor's mind, Dean's words and the face of the girl she had seen earlier kept appearing and disappearing alternately. Another child. The thought was terrifying, yet at the same time, it lit a small flame of hope in her heart. Around 9 p.m., the phone rang. Dean picked up the remote control and turned down the volume on the TV, and Eleanor answered the phone. "Is this Eleanor Morgan?" The male voice was official and somewhat tense. "This is Detective Parker from the Mount Willow Police Department. I'm sorry to inform you that your daughter has been in an accident and has been taken to the hospital." The blood drained from Eleanor's face. "What did you say?" "Your daughter was in a traffic accident. She's currently being transported to Maryland General Hospital. Fortunately, her life is not in danger." Eleanor's hand trembled. "What do you mean?" "Our daughter." She faltered, took a deep breath, and continued. "Our daughter passed away 3 years ago." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. "The girl says her name is Sophie Morgan. She didn't have any identification, but she keeps repeating, 'Call my mother.'" The detective's voice reflected his confusion. Eleanor felt as if she might collapse. The room began to spin, and she leaned against the wall for support. "Elle, what's wrong?" Dean approached, looking concerned. "Dean." Eleanor said with a trembling voice. It's the police. They say Sophie. Sophie is at the hospital. The blood drained from Dean's face. What did you say? Eleanor told the detective, we'll be right there. After hanging up, Eleanor and Dean stared at each other. Unspoken questions hung in the air between them. It must be some mistake. Dean was the first to speak. That's impossible. But Eleanor remembered the girl she had seen outside the shop. The girl I saw in front of the shop today, there was something familiar about her. Dean grabbed his coat and car keys. Let's go to the hospital anyway. In the car, they maintained silence. Eleanor's mind was like a storm. It's impossible, she told herself. The DNA test confirmed it. Sophie is dead. And yet, in a corner of her heart, a spark of hope had begun to ignite. If it really is Sophie. Eleanor murmured softly. Dean nodded firmly, his eyes fixed on the road. But that's impossible. Let's prepare ourselves. Eleanor looked out the window. Moonlight filtered through the clouds, illuminating the road. She remembered that a similar moon had been out the night of the fire 3 years ago. After parking in the hospital lot, Eleanor and Dean hurried to the emergency entrance. Detective Parker was waiting for them. Mr. and Mrs. Morgan, this way, he guided them to the pediatric ward. Walking down the white corridor, Eleanor's heart was pounding rapidly. She still couldn't tell if this was reality or a cruel joke. Dr. Harper, the attending physician, greeted them outside the room. Mr. and Mrs. Morgan. The situation is complex, but the girl's injuries are minor. She was hit by a car, but fortunately, there are no fractures or serious internal injuries. However, I'm concerned about her mental state. She's extremely frightened. Is she really our daughter? Eleanor asked cautiously. The doctor chose his words carefully. She clearly recognizes you both, and her name matches. But I can't say for certain. We're scheduled to do a DNA test tomorrow. Eleanor gripped Dean's hand tightly. Outside the hospital room door, Eleanor felt as if her feet had taken root in the ground, unable to move. Was it really her daughter on the other side of the door? Or was this all a cruel mistake? It's okay, Dean placed his hand on her back and whispered in a low voice. We're together. Eleanor took a deep breath. With trembling hands, she turned the doorknob and slowly opened the door. The room was dimly lit, with moonlight filtering in through the window. A small figure lay on the bed placed in the center of the room. As they approached the bed, Eleanor and Dean gasped. There was indeed a little girl there. She had a cast on her right leg and left arm, and scrapes on her face, but her features were unmistakably Sophie. Eleanor's voice trembled. The girl opened her eyes. Large brown eyes, clouded with fatigue and fear, looked at Eleanor. After a moment of silence, the girl's lips quivered, and a small voice escaped. Mommy. The moment she heard that word, Eleanor's knees went weak. Dean supported her, and they both sat in chairs placed beside the girl's bed. Is it really you? Sophie? Eleanor asked, unable to believe it. The girl quietly nodded. And suddenly, tears welled up in her eyes. Mommy, I was scared. The girl said in a trembling voice. Don't take me away. I don't want to go back to those people. Eleanor instinctively moved forward and took the girl's small hand. The touch of her skin, that warmth, it was undeniably her daughter's. Eleanor was overwhelmed by a wave of emotion, and her tears wouldn't stop. Sophie, it really is you, she squeezed her daughter's hand tightly. I'll never let you go again. Dean also moved to Sophie's bedside and carefully stroked her head. Daddy's here too, Sophie. Everything's going to be okay now. The family of 3 was enveloped in emotions that couldn't be put into words. Joy, relief, and confusion and anger. What had happened during these 3 years? How was their daughter here now when she was supposed to be dead? What happened? Dean quietly asked. What happened the night of the fire? At that question, they felt Sophie's body tense. She cowered fearfully and leaned toward Eleanor. That's okay for now, Eleanor quickly said. Sophie, you don't have to push yourself. You're safe now. From the corner of the room, Dr. Harper discreetly cleared his throat. May I have a word with you too? Eleanor and Dean reluctantly left Sophie's side and moved to the corner of the room. We'll conduct DNA testing first thing tomorrow morning, the doctor explained in a low voice. And the police would like to speak with her as well. However, considering the girl's mental state, a specialized counselor should be present. Dean nodded with a stern expression. If she really is our daughter, then someone abducted her for 3 years. And another child was. He choked on his words. The doctor nodded understandingly. We'll cooperate to ensure that all questions are answered. Will you both be staying here tonight? Of course, Eleanor answered immediately. I don't intend to leave my daughter. I'll have a cot prepared for you, the doctor said, and quietly left the room. Eleanor and Dean sat on either side of Sophie's bed. The girl looked exhausted but held their hands tightly. Mommy, Daddy. Sophie whispered before falling asleep. Did I really come back? This isn't a dream, is it? It's not a dream, Sweet Pea, Dean called his daughter by her nickname. We won't be separated again. Sophie eventually fell asleep, but Eleanor and Dean couldn't sleep. They just gazed at their daughter, occasionally exchanging glances. Unspoken questions and anger swirled in those glances. Who could have taken their daughter? And who was the child who supposedly died in the fire? As dawn broke and the morning sun began to shine through the hospital room window, Sophie woke up. She first looked around cautiously but relaxed when she recognized her parents. Good morning, sunshine, Eleanor said with a smile. Her eyes looked tired, but her face was filled with happiness. Good morning, Mommy, Sophie smiled faintly. Breakfast was brought in, and Sophie began to eat slowly. Her movements were awkward, and she seemed to be constantly vigilant. Eleanor and Dean watched worriedly but tried not to rush her. Today, some people will be coming to see you, Eleanor explained gently. Doctors and police officers who want to make sure you're safe. Don't be afraid. We'll be right here with you. Sophie nodded anxiously. Those people won't come, will they? Those people. Dean leaned forward. Who do you mean, Sophie? But at that moment, there was a knock on the door, and Dr. Harper entered along with a female police officer and a middle-aged woman. Good morning, the doctor greeted cheerfully. This is Detective Green and Linda Patterson, a child psychologist. The detective smiled kindly, and the counselor, Linda, approached Sophie carefully. Good morning, Sophie. I'm Linda. May I talk with you for a bit? Sophie looked at Eleanor. Eleanor nodded encouragingly and whispered, It's okay. After the DNA test procedures were completed, Linda needed to speak with Sophie alone, so Eleanor and Dean had to wait in the hallway. I can't believe this is real, Dean said, leaning against the wall. How could this happen? Eleanor took her husband's hand. I don't know either. But Sophie is back. That much is certain. An hour later, Linda emerged from the hospital room. Her expression was complex, indicating something serious had happened. Mr. and Mrs. Morgan, I need to speak with you, she led them to a small consultation room. Once inside, Linda took a deep breath and said, Sophie has gradually started to talk about the night of the fire. It's still fragmented, but... She hesitated for a moment, then continued. According to her, on the night of the fire, someone took her from her room. At first, she referred to them as Grandpa and Grandma, but later mentioned the names of George and Miriam. Do these names mean anything to you? Dean's face went pale. They're my parents. Eleanor gasped. Miriam and George took Sophie. But why? Linda nodded gravely. According to her, on the night of the fire, they took her out of the house and told her, "Don't go back home." Then they took her to Aunt Cassandra's house. Cassandra. Dean was at a loss for words. My sister. I can't believe it. Dean held his head in his hands. My own parents and sister, doing something like this. Eleanor was speechless. Various memories raced through her mind like a kaleidoscope. Miriam's cold gaze. The words, "if you had been more careful." Cassandra's sudden disappearance. And above all, their unnatural behavior after the fire. And your parents, ma'am? Linda quietly asked. My parents passed away 10 years ago, Eleanor answered mechanically. Her mind was full of confusion. At this point, Detective Green entered the consultation room. Her expression was stern, and she had a notepad in her hand. Could you provide the exact addresses of your parents and Cassandra? She asked immediately. We need to contact local police and begin an investigation. Though shaken, Dean provided his parents' address. But my sister. I don't know exactly where she is now. She said she moved to the countryside 3 years ago, but she didn't give me a specific address. When was the last time you had contact with her? About 1.5 years ago. We received a Christmas card. The postmark was from Portland, Maine. Detective Green noted this down. We'll work with state police to locate her. And also, she continued, choosing her words carefully. We need to review the fire investigation records, including the body that was supposedly identified through DNA testing. At those words, a heavy silence fell over the room. There was no doubt that a child had died in the fire. Whose child was it? And why was that child in Sophie's room? When will the DNA test results be available? Eleanor asked. Normally it takes several days, but considering the circumstances, we're expediting it. The results should be available tomorrow afternoon, Detective Green answered. However, she pointed to the photographs Sophie had shown them. Honestly, judging from this, I think there's little doubt she's your daughter. Eleanor and Dean returned to the hospital room. Sophie looked tired, but her eyes brightened when she saw her parents. Mommy, Daddy, you came back. Eleanor gently touched her daughter's cheek. We'll always be here, I promise. In the afternoon, after Dr. Harper finished examining Sophie, he informed them that her injuries were not as serious as initially thought. She would likely be discharged after a few days of hospitalization and observation. However, psychological care will be necessary, the doctor quietly added. She shows extreme anxiety and fear. I recommend professional counseling. That evening, after Sophie had fallen asleep, Linda spoke with Eleanor and Dean again. She relayed the facts that had gradually become clear from her conversations with Sophie. From what she's told me, on the night of the fire, your parents took her out and brought her to your sister's house. There, Sophie was told to live under the name Lily, and was forbidden from talking about her real parents. They kept her prisoner all this time. Dean's voice trembled with anger. It was more psychological control than physical confinement. She was told constantly that she couldn't return to her parents because she was a bad girl. And she was threatened that worse things would happen if she talked about her parents. Eleanor's chest ached. The thought of her daughter living in such fear for 3 years brought tears to her eyes. And Sophie ran away because... Linda continued carefully. She heard Cassandra saying she wanted another little sister. She overheard a conversation about bringing another child, and fled the house in terror. How awful. Eleanor covered her mouth with a trembling hand. Other children too. The police have already begun their investigation, Linda said with a serious expression. From your testimony and Sophie's story, this was almost certainly a planned abduction. And the fire too. It wasn't an accident, Dean continued. It was planned. Linda nodded quietly. What concerns me most is the identity of the child who died in the fire. Sophie hasn't mentioned the existence of other children. But from Cassandra's comment about another child, there was no need to put it into words. Everyone in the room was considering the same terrible possibility. The next afternoon, the DNA test results arrived. When Dr. Harper entered the room with the results, Eleanor and Dean were filled with expectation and anxiety. The test results are in, the doctor said with a smile. There's no doubt. She is Sophie Morgan. She is your daughter. Eleanor sighed with relief. Now that it was scientifically confirmed, the last shadow of doubt in her heart disappeared. Meanwhile, the police investigation was progressing. Detective Green arrived with new information. A warrant has been issued to search the home of Dean's parents. We've also identified the last known address of Cassandra in Maine. Searches will be conducted at both locations simultaneously. I want to go too, Dean stood up. I want to see with my own eyes what they did. Detective Green showed understanding but shook her head. Right now, your priority should be to be with your family. We'll inform you of the search results immediately. Sophie's condition was gradually beginning to stabilize. She still suffered from nightmares and was occasionally seized by sudden panic, but her parents' presence gave her comfort. Particularly, the bond between her and Eleanor grew stronger with each passing day. Mommy, Sophie said one morning, holding Eleanor's hand. I remembered your shop. I always remembered I was Sophie, not Lily. Tears welled up in Eleanor's eyes. Guilty on all charges. When the judge's words echoed through the courtroom, Eleanor quietly closed her eyes. Dean's hand squeezed hers tightly. It was an ending, but also a new beginning. A week after the incident, Miriam, George, and Cassandra were arrested at the state border. They were on their way to a town with their next target child. Initially, all three denied the charges, but their lies crumbled in the face of evidence found in Cassandra's house, diaries, plans, and proof of the fire. At the trial, all three were charged with multiple crimes, including attempted murder by arson, kidnapping, abuse, and identity theft. Particularly shocking was the identity of the child who died in the fire. It was a homeless woman's child who had been reported missing. They had placed that child in Sophie's room and intentionally started the fire. Miriam and George's defense, claiming they had cooperated out of concern for their granddaughter's mental state, was thoroughly refuted by the prosecution. Given the high level of premeditation, it was determined there were no mitigating circumstances, and all three received the maximum penalty. The middle school auditorium was filled with applause. 11-year-old Sophie Morgan stood on the stage, about to receive the championship trophy for a speech contest on the theme, What is Family? Family is not just about blood ties, but is built on love, trust, and respect for each other's freedom. True family doesn't own but supports growth. Her words were met with loud applause from the audience. Tears welled up in Eleanor's eyes as she sat in the front row. It had been 3 years since then. Her daughter had overcome difficulties with strength beyond imagination. On the way home, Sophie suddenly stopped. Mom, there's something I want to ask. Eleanor smiled gently. Anything, sweetie. Can I write a letter to Aunt Cassandra? Eleanor's eyes widened in surprise. Dean also looked at his daughter in astonishment. Why? Dean quietly asked. Sophie looked up at the sky. I can't forgive her, but I want to know why it happened. I feel like I can't move forward without that. Eleanor and Dean exchanged glances. There was surprise, but also respect for their daughter's growth. Of course, Eleanor gently embraced her daughter's shoulders. "I respect your decision. A real family doesn't hurt each other, but respects each other's choices no matter what," Sophie repeated the words from her speech. "I understand that now, and that's why I am who I am today." The setting sun cast their long shadows on the road. The darkness of the past might never completely disappear, but they were walking in the light. Eleanor felt from the bottom of her heart that this was not the end, but a true beginning.